The first time my father called me stupid in public that spring, he didn't even lower his voice. He said it with a soft laugh over champagne, like it was a harmless family joke, like the word had been polished smooth by years of use and no longer had edges sharp enough to cut. We were standing in the plaza ballroom beneath chandeliers so bright they made everything look expensive and unreal. My sister was 10 feet away, in a white dress that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, smiling into someone's camera, already stepping into the future my parents had been building for her since she was 12. And me? I was standing near the back wall with a half-empty glass of sparkling water, trying to make myself look like someone who belonged there. "You know how Lila is," my father told one of his investors, not bothering to check whether I could hear him. "Sweet girl, slow as winter traffic, but sweet." The man laughed politely. My mother did too. Something in my chest went very still. That was the strange part. Not hot, not wild. Still. Because humiliation had stopped feeling like a surprise in my family a long time ago, it had become a kind of weather. Predictable. Seasonal. A cold front I could sense before anyone else felt the drop in temperature. I remember staring at the gold trim on the ballroom wall and thinking, if I leave right now, nobody will notice. Then my father lifted his glass against it and tapped for attention. Conversations softened. Music faded. My sister turned toward him with that practiced expression she wore so well, modest, glowing, grateful on cue. He smiled at her like she was the sun he had personally raised into the sky. And that was the moment I knew whatever came next would change something in me for good. Because there are only so many years a person can sit quietly inside the story other people wrote about her before she begins to wonder whether disappearing might actually make things easier for everyone else. My name is Lila Carrington. I was 28 years old that night, and for most of my life my parents had called me the dumb one. Not to my face at first. At first it was softer than that. Sensitive. Behind. Not really academic. The kind of words people use when they want to sound merciful while they reduce you. My older sister Vanessa was the shining one. Yale, law review, polished posture, perfect timing, the daughter my parents introduced with both hands open like they were unveiling a sculpture. I was the one they explained away, the one they turned into a footnote before anyone could ask questions. Some of you listening already know what that feels like. When you've lived through being underestimated inside your own home, you recognize the silence it teaches you. Stay with me. This is your space. Subscribe. Because the worst part wasn't what they called me. It was how long I believed them. For most of my childhood, the word slow followed me around the house like a shadow. Not shouted. Not cruel in the obvious way. Just quietly repeated until it felt permanent. I was 7 when my school counselor first told my parents I had dyslexia. I still remember sitting in that tiny office with the bright alphabet posters on the wall, watching the adults talk about me like I wasn't in the room. Her intelligence is normal, the counselor explained gently, but the way she processes written language is different. With the right support, she can absolutely succeed. My mother nodded politely. My father crossed his arms. On the drive home, they were quiet for a long time. Finally, my father said, "So basically she just reads slow." That was the version that stuck. At school, letters sometimes slid across the page like they were floating on water. Sentences twisted. Words broke apart and rearranged themselves. Reading a paragraph could take me 3 times longer than everyone else. But I learned something early. If you listened closely enough, people always told you who they believed you were. And my parents had already decided. Vanessa got violin lessons with a Juilliard instructor. Vanessa got French tutoring. Vanessa got SAT coaching when she was 14. When I asked if I could see a reading specialist again, my mother sighed at the kitchen counter. "Lila, sweetheart, we've already spent so much on testing." She turned back to slicing lemons for her tea. "At some point we have to accept that not every child is academic." I was 12. And when adults say things like that, children don't question them. They absorb them. So I stopped asking. Instead, I found my own ways around the problem. Audiobooks became my lifeline. I'd listen to entire textbooks while drawing diagrams in notebooks, little maps showing how ideas connected, arrows, shapes, patterns. It helped. Information made sense to me when I could see the structure of it, not just the words. I didn't realize then that this strange habit would someday become the skill that saved me. At the time, it just felt like survival. The only person who never treated my dyslexia like a defect was my grandmother, Eleanor. Every Sunday afternoon, I took the subway up to her apartment on the Upper West Side. Her place smelled like old books and peppermint tea, and the windows looked out toward Riverside Park. She never asked about grades first. She asked what I was thinking about. One afternoon when I was 14, I told her how long it took me to read compared to other kids. She listened quietly. Then she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Lila," she said softly, "reading slower doesn't mean you understand less." Her eyes were sharp, the kind that seemed to look straight through people. "Sometimes it means you see what everyone else misses." I didn't fully understand what she meant then, but she said it with such certainty that part of me wanted to believe her. And for a few hours every Sunday, in that quiet apartment above the city, I almost did. If you're listening to this somewhere tonight and you know what it's like to grow up feeling like the extra piece in your own family, tell me where you're listening from. Drop your city below. Stories travel farther than we think. Back then, though, I had no idea how far this one was about to go. Family gatherings were the worst. Not because anyone yelled. The Carringtons were far too polished for that. Humiliation in my family arrived dressed in silk and good manners. It was Christmas 2018 when I first understood how permanent my role had become. 20 relatives sat around the long mahogany dining table in my parents' Manhattan townhouse. Crystal glasses, catered dinner, candles reflected in polished silver. My mother believed presentation could fix almost anything. Vanessa sat beside my father at the head of the table. I was halfway down the side, near the corner where the light didn't quite reach. Dinner had just finished when my father stood and lifted his wine glass. I'd like everyone's attention for a moment. The room quieted immediately. He loved moments like this. "My daughter Vanessa has some wonderful news." Vanessa gave a small, practiced smile. "She's been accepted to Harvard Law School, full scholarship." The room exploded into applause. My aunt gasped. Someone whistled. My uncle slapped the table and shouted, "Another Carrington heading to Harvard." My father looked like a man who had personally engineered the achievement. "She's going to take this family to extraordinary places," he said proudly. Vanessa blushed modestly, exactly the way people expected her to. Then my father's gaze drifted down the table. To me. "And Lila?" He paused. For a second, I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe he'd say something kind. Instead, he shrugged lightly. "Well, Lila is also here tonight." A few relatives chuckled awkwardly. The kind of laugh people give when they know something isn't funny but don't want to make things uncomfortable. I stared down at my plate. The roasted lamb blurred behind the tears I refused to let fall. Across the table, Vanessa laughed softly with everyone else. Underneath the tablecloth, a hand slipped into mine. I looked up. Grandma Eleanor. She didn't smile. Her expression was something far quieter and far sharper than that. Anger. Not loud anger. The kind that sits still and remembers. She squeezed my hand gently. And in that moment I realized something strange. She had seen everything. Not just that dinner. All of it. Later that night, as guests were leaving and coats were being collected, she pulled me aside near the hallway mirror. "Come see me this weekend," she said quietly. Her voice carried the calm authority that had built half the Carrington real estate portfolio back in the 70s. "There's something I want to show you." I nodded. I didn't know then that this small invitation would become the beginning of something much bigger than either of us said out loud. Because sometimes the people who stay silent the longest are the ones who have been paying the closest attention. And my grandmother had been watching my father for years. Watching how he spoke. Watching what he did. Watching how easily a family story could erase someone standing right in the room. If you've ever been the quiet one people overlooked at the table, type, "I understand." More people share that feeling than you'd think. At the time, though, I still believed something dangerous. I believed that if I worked hard enough, my parents would eventually see me differently. I had no idea that 5 years later, the truth about that belief would explode in the middle of a Manhattan ballroom. 3 months after that Christmas dinner, I went to see my grandmother. Her apartment on the Upper West Side hadn't changed in 40 years. Same faded Persian rug, same shelves full of binders and old real estate documents. Same view of the Hudson through tall windows that rattled whenever a bus rolled past on Broadway. To most people, she was just an elderly woman in a quiet building. But once upon a time, Eleanor Carrington had been the one building deals while everyone else in Manhattan was still figuring out zoning laws. She had started Carrington Properties in 1965, with a single rented office in Brooklyn and a desk that still sat in the corner of her living room. My father inherited the company. She built it. When I arrived that Sunday afternoon, she was sitting in her armchair with a blanket over her knees, reading glasses low on her nose. She looked smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were still sharp. "Sit down, Lila." I sat across from her. For a moment she just studied my face, like she was checking whether something inside me had shifted. Finally she spoke. "Do you know why your father dislikes weakness so much?" The question surprised me. "I don't think he dislikes weakness," I said carefully. "I think he just respects achievement." My grandmother gave a quiet laugh. "That's the same lie he tells himself." She leaned back slowly. "Gerald respects power, and credentials are the easiest costume power can wear." The room fell quiet. Then she reached beside her chair and lifted a small wooden box onto the table between us. Mahogany, brass hinges. It looked old. "Take this," she said. I frowned. "What is it?" "Something you might need someday." Her voice softened slightly. "But not yet." I turned the box over in my hands. Why me? That question had been living inside me for years. Why had she always treated me differently from the rest of the family? Why did she talk to me like I was capable of things no one else believed? She watched me carefully. "Because you pay attention." I blinked. "Your father reads contracts like a lawyer," she continued. "He looks for loopholes." She tapped the wooden box lightly. "You read situations like an architect. You see how everything connects." I thought about the diagrams I used to draw while listening to audiobooks. The patterns. The systems. The relationships between decisions. "I'm not sure that's a real skill," I admitted. "Oh, it is," she said quietly. "And one day it may matter more than you realize." She pushed the box toward me. "Keep it somewhere safe." I ran my fingers across the brass latch. "When should I open it?" My grandmother's eyes held mine for a long moment. "You'll know." Then she reached forward and squeezed my hand. "Lila, when people underestimate you long enough, they start believing their own story." Her voice dropped softer. "Don't let their version of you become your truth." I nodded, though I wasn't sure how to follow advice like that when the people telling the story were my own parents. Before I left that afternoon, she added one more thing. "If life ever puts you in a position of power," she said, "remember this." Her tone turned serious again. "Justice and revenge look very similar at first." She gave a small smile. "But they lead to very different endings." I didn't understand why she said that. Not yet. And when I placed that wooden box in the back of my closet that evening, I never imagined it would sit there unopened for 5 years, waiting for the exact moment when my father would finally show me who he really was. For the next few years, nothing about my life looked like it was going anywhere important. After graduating from a small state university in 2022, definitely not Yale, definitely not Harvard, I applied for a position at Carrington Properties. Part of me hoped that working inside the family company might finally change how my parents saw me. Maybe if they watched me work every day. Maybe if I proved I could contribute. Maybe then things would shift. My father agreed to hire me, but not the way I imagined. My official title was administrative assistant. Salary, $42,000 a year. My sister Vanessa joined the company the same month. Her title: Chief Legal Strategist. Salary: $280,000 plus bonuses. No one pretended the difference was unusual. My desk sat near the copy room on the 32nd floor. My job involved printing contracts, organizing binders, booking conference rooms, and occasionally running downstairs to grab coffee for executives who never quite remembered my name. Sometimes they called me Laura. Sometimes Linda. No one corrected them. I wasn't invited to strategy meetings. I wasn't included in deal discussions. But I listened. That was the strange advantage of being invisible. People spoke freely around someone they didn't consider important. Through half-open doors and hallway conversations, I heard executives discussing acquisitions, partnerships, land permits, investment structures. While they talked, I drew diagrams in my notebook. Boxes, arrows, flowcharts. Who owned what? Where money moved. Where decisions connected. It was the same system I'd used in school to understand books that took me too long to read. Only now, it worked with business. One afternoon in the copy room, I overheard two senior directors arguing about a property development deal. "It's not the zoning problem," one said. "It's the financing structure." The other shook his head. "No, the structure is fine." I glanced at the contract spread across the copier glass. Something about the ownership percentages looked wrong. The flow didn't close. Before I could stop myself, I spoke. "The investors form a loop," I said quietly. Both men looked at me. "What?" I pointed to the page. "If this partner sells early, the debt shifts twice. That means the project loses liquidity." They stared at me for a moment. Then one of them frowned down at the paper again. She's right." I felt my face heat instantly. "Sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." The older director waved a hand. "No harm done." Then he turned back to the conversation as if nothing had happened. 10 minutes later, they were gone. No one mentioned it again. But I noticed something that day. For a brief moment, the story my parents had written about me, the slow daughter, the extra one, had cracked a little. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Just a small fracture. The kind that only someone paying attention would notice. If you've ever been underestimated long enough that people forget to watch what you're capable of, you know how powerful that moment can feel. You don't need applause. You just need evidence. At the time, though, I still thought my future inside the company depended on my father eventually recognizing those moments. I hadn't yet accepted a harder truth. Sometimes people don't ignore your value because they can't see it. Sometimes they ignore it because your value threatens the story they built their lives on. And my father had built an entire empire around the idea that I was the weak link in our family. The wooden box in my closet stayed closed. My grandmother had said I would know when to open it. Back then, I still believed that moment might never come. I was wrong. The email that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:12 p.m. At first, I thought it was just another scheduling notice. Subject line: Position restructuring. Confidential. I opened it while standing beside the office printer, the machine humming softly as it spat out copies of a lease agreement no one would ever remember I printed. The words blurred at first. Not because of dyslexia. Because sometimes your brain refuses to accept what it's reading. Dear Miss Carrington, as part of our ongoing organizational restructuring, your current role will be eliminated effective July 1st. I read the sentence 3 times. Then the rest. Severance package. Transition assistance. Human resources would contact me soon. That was it. 2 years of working quietly inside my family's company, and I was being erased with a 3-paragraph email. No meeting. No conversation. Just deleted. The strangest part was how calm I felt at first. Like my mind had stepped slightly outside my body to watch it happen. I finished printing the documents, stacked them neatly, walked back to my desk. But around 6 that evening, when most of the office had emptied out, I heard voices through the thin wall separating my cubicle from my father's corner office. My father. And my mother. We can't have her here once Vanessa takes over, my father said. My chest tightened. People will start asking questions. What kind of questions? My mother asked softly. Why the CEO's sister is working as a secretary. A pause. Then he added something that felt colder than anything he'd ever said directly to me. Why she's the way she is. My mother sighed. We did everything we could for her, Gerald. No, he replied. We did more than enough. Silence filled the room for a moment. Then my father spoke again. It's time she finds something more suited to her abilities. I stood there with my hand against the wall, feeling every word settle into place like the final piece of a puzzle I had been avoiding my whole life. They weren't protecting me. They were removing me. And for the first time in 28 years, a thought crossed my mind that scared me almost as much as it freed me. What if I stopped trying to prove them wrong and started proving myself right instead? Some of you listening know that exact moment. The second, when something inside you quietly says, enough. If that feeling sounds familiar, tell me in the comments. Just write, I get it. Because the next night at my sister's graduation celebration, something happened that none of us were prepared for. And it started with a stranger walking across a crowded ballroom, carrying an envelope with my name on it. I almost didn't go to my sister's graduation party. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks earlier, in thick cream paper with gold lettering, the kind of card that felt heavier than it needed to be, as if the weight itself was meant to impress people. Vanessa Carrington. Harvard Law School, class of 2024. Celebration Gala, the Plaza Hotel. My mother called the event a small gathering. 350 guests. Investors. Partners. Old money friends who had known my parents long enough to pretend they remembered my name. By the time I stepped into the Plaza ballroom that evening, the room was already glowing with champagne glasses and camera flashes. My dress had cost $79. I remember checking the tag twice before buying it. Everyone else looked like they had stepped out of magazine pages. My mother intercepted me near the entrance. Her eyes moved slowly from my shoes to my hair. You couldn't find anything nicer? This is what I have, I said quietly. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Well, try not to stand too close to the photographers. Then she lowered her voice. And Lila? I waited. Tonight is Vanessa's night. Her smile stayed perfectly polite. Let's not make it about you. I nodded, because that had always been the rule. My table was near the back of the ballroom, half hidden behind a marble pillar. From there I could see the stage where a giant portrait of Vanessa hung behind the podium, her Harvard graduation photo framed by gold lights. She looked radiant, confident. Exactly the daughter my parents had spent 20 years presenting to the world. At 8:30 p.m., the orchestra stopped playing. My father stepped onto the stage and tapped his glass. The room quieted instantly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said warmly, thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate an extraordinary young woman. Applause filled the ballroom. Vanessa walked up beside him in an emerald gown that shimmered under the lights. My father placed a hand proudly on her shoulder. Tonight isn't just about her graduation, he continued. It's about the future of our family. I felt something tighten in my stomach. Because I had heard that tone before. That was the voice he used when he was about to make an announcement that left no space for anyone else. If you've ever been the quiet person sitting at the far end of the table while someone else tells the story of your family, you know exactly what that moment feels like. Sometimes the loudest part of a room is the silence around you. And what my father said next would make that silence even louder. The moment my father announced my sister would inherit everything, the room exploded with applause. But the strange thing was, I didn't hear most of it. Because when humiliation hits a certain depth, sound fades. Conversations blur. It's like your mind steps a few feet back from your body just to survive the moment. Effective immediately, my father said proudly from the stage. Vanessa Carrington will inherit the Carrington estate and assume leadership of Carrington Properties when I retire. 300 people stood and clapped. Crystal glasses lifted. Someone shouted congratulations. Behind them, the orchestra started playing again. My sister wiped a tear from her cheek in that graceful, practiced way she had perfected over years of public praise. My father continued, "The Park Avenue residence, currently valued at $13 million. More applause. And of course," he added with a smile, "her new Tesla Model S to celebrate the beginning of this next chapter." Laughter rippled across the ballroom. I sat perfectly still at table 27. No one looked in my direction. Not one person. It was almost impressive, the way a human being could disappear in a room that full. The cousin sitting beside me leaned over. "Lila, right?" she asked. I nodded politely. "So, what does that leave you?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because I honestly didn't know. Earlier that afternoon, I had read the email telling me my job at the company would be eliminated in 2 months. Now I was watching my father publicly hand the future of the entire family to my sister, like it had never even occurred to him that I existed. For a moment, something heavy settled in my chest. Not anger. Not jealousy. Something quieter. Final. Like a door closing inside me that had been open for years. That was when I noticed him. A man standing near the ballroom entrance. Silver hair. Gray suit. He wasn't talking to anyone. Wasn't drinking. He was just watching the room. And then his eyes met mine. Directly. The look wasn't curious. It wasn't judgmental. It was intentional. Like he had been waiting for something. Waiting for this exact moment. Some of you listening know that feeling. When life suddenly pauses for half a second, and something inside you whispers that the story is about to turn. If you've ever lived through a moment like that, drop your city in the comments. I always wonder how far these stories travel. Because 30 seconds later, that man started walking straight toward my table. And in his hand was a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front. The man with the silver hair didn't rush. That's the first thing I remember. In a ballroom full of noise and celebration, he moved slowly, like someone who knew exactly where he was going and didn't feel the need to hurry. The orchestra was playing again. My father and Vanessa were still shaking hands on stage. No one noticed him crossing the room. Except me. He stopped beside my table and looked down at me with the calm focus of someone who had spent many years inside courtrooms. "Miss Carrington?" My throat tightened slightly. "Yes." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a cream envelope sealed with a small red wax stamp. "My name is Jonathan Ellis," he said quietly. He handed me a card. "Ellis and Hartwell, attorneys at law. I served as your grandmother Eleanor's legal counsel." The word grandmother landed gently but heavily at the same time. Eleanor Carrington had passed away almost 3 years earlier. "I'm sorry," I said automatically, "but why are you giving this to me?" His expression softened just slightly. "Because she asked me to." I stared at the envelope. My name was written across the front, in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Your grandmother left instructions," he continued, "very specific ones." The ballroom lights shimmered across the wax seal. "When she passed, I was told to deliver this document to you." He glanced briefly toward the stage where my father was still basking in applause. "On the day your father publicly showed the world exactly how he sees you." A chill moved slowly down my spine. "I believe," Mr. Ellis said gently, "that moment just happened." My fingers trembled as I took the envelope. It felt heavier than a few sheets of paper should. "What's inside?" I asked quietly. He adjusted his tie. "That," he said, "is something you should read somewhere quieter than this room." Then he added one more thing. "Your grandmother trusted you with it." He nodded once and stepped away, disappearing back into the crowd almost as quietly as he had appeared. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the envelope. 300 people were celebrating my sister. My father was raising another toast. And in my hands was a letter from the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. If you've made it this far into the story and something about it feels familiar, stay. Strength grows here. Subscribe. Because when I finally broke that wax seal 10 minutes later in the hallway outside the ballroom, my entire life changed in 3 sentences. I didn't open the envelope in the ballroom. Something about it felt too important for a room full of champagne and applause. So I slipped out through the service hallway beside the kitchen, where the noise of the orchestra softened into a distant hum, and the bright gold lights of the party disappeared behind a plain white door. For the first time that night, the air felt quiet. I leaned against the wall and turned the envelope over in my hands. The wax seal had my grandmother's initials pressed into it. E.C. My chest tightened. Grandma Eleanor had been the only person in my family who never called me slow. The only one who asked what I thought instead of what I achieved. Slowly, I broke the seal. Inside were 3 folded pages. Legal paper. Typed. Stamped. The first line made my hands go cold. I, Eleanor Margaret Carrington, being of sound mind and judgment. I blinked and started again. Because sometimes your brain refuses to believe what it's reading the first time. My eyes moved slowly down the page. Then they stopped. To my granddaughter, Lila Ann Carrington, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Carrington Properties, including full voting rights and controlling interest. For a moment the hallway seemed to tilt slightly. 51%. Controlling interest. That meant... The paper trembled in my hands as I kept reading. This decision is made with full awareness of the treatment Lila has received within our family. A lump rose in my throat. She has been dismissed, overlooked, and denied opportunity, not because she lacks ability, but because she was never given the support required to demonstrate it. My vision blurred. My grandmother had seen it. All of it. Every dinner, every joke, every quiet humiliation. The letter continued. Lila is not slow. Lila was abandoned. The words felt like someone gently unlocking a door inside my chest that had been sealed for years. At the bottom of the page was a final paragraph. And a condition. To activate this bequest, Lila must request an emergency board meeting within 72 hours of receiving this document. Failure to act within this period will nullify the transfer. 72 hours. 3 days. My pulse began to race. Through the ballroom doors behind me, I could still hear applause echoing. My father celebrating my sister's future. My sister accepting the inheritance they had planned for her entire life. And in my hands was a document that could change everything. If you're still here listening, I want to pause for 1 second and say something. Strength doesn't beg, it builds. Subscribe. Because what happened in the boardroom 3 days later was something my father never saw coming. And the first step began with a phone call I made the very next morning. I didn't sleep that night. Not even a little. The document sat on my kitchen table while the city outside my apartment window slowly moved from midnight silence to the gray light of early morning. I must have read my grandmother's will 20 times. Each time the same sentence stopped my breath. 51%. Controlling interest. For 28 years, my family had treated me like I barely belonged in the room. And suddenly, on paper, I owned the room. But the will came with one condition. 72 hours. If I didn't act within 3 days, the entire inheritance would vanish, and the company would pass to the version of the future my father had already announced to the world. Which meant the next step had to happen immediately. At 9:04 the next morning, I made the phone call. Margaret Coleman answered on the second ring. Margaret had served on the Carrington Properties Board for more than 30 years. She had built half the company beside my grandmother long before my father took control. Lila Carrington, she said calmly. I wondered when you'd call. I sat up straighter. You knew? Your grandmother told me everything 3 years ago. Paper rustled on the other end of the line. She also told me one more thing. What was that? I asked quietly. Margaret's voice softened just slightly. That one day you'd stop believing the story your father wrote about you. A pause filled the line. Then her tone shifted into something more businesslike. You want to request an emergency board meeting, don't you? My heart pounded. Yes. Well, she said calmly, Then we should start making some phone calls. If you're listening right now and you know what it feels like when someone finally believes in you before you believe in yourself, tell me in the comments. Because the next 48 hours were about to turn my father's entire empire upside down. The hardest part wasn't calling the board. It was walking into the building the next morning like nothing had changed. Carrington Tower stood on 42nd Street exactly the way it always had. Glass, steel, and quiet confidence. The kind of building designed to remind people who held power inside it. For 2 years I had entered through the side employee doors. This time I walked straight through the front lobby. The security guard nodded politely. No one else noticed. That was the strange thing about power. Sometimes it exists long before anyone realizes it. At 9:40 a.m., my phone buzzed. Margaret Coleman. "It's done," she said. My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I've secured the signatures. 3 board members requested the emergency session." Paper shuffled faintly on her end of the line. "The meeting is scheduled for Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. 2 days away." My pulse quickened. "Does my father know?" I asked. Margaret gave a quiet chuckle. "He will soon." I stepped into the elevator and watched the floor numbers climb. For years I had ridden this elevator to the copy room. Now I was heading to the same floor with something entirely different sitting quietly in my bag. Proof. Not revenge. Proof. If you're still following this story, and you believe quiet strength matters more than loud revenge, real power moves in silence, subscribe. Because the moment my father discovered that board meeting request was the moment the ground began shifting under his feet. I found out exactly when that happened the following afternoon. My phone rang. Caller ID, Vanessa. My sister never called me. Not unless something was wrong. I answered. "Lila," she said sharply. "What did you do?" My sister's voice had never sounded like that before. Sharp. Controlled. Like someone trying very hard not to panic. "What did you do?" Vanessa repeated. I was standing beside the copy machine when the call came in. The same place where I had spent hundreds of quiet hours printing contracts no one believed I understood. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said calmly. A short silence followed. Then she exhaled slowly. "Dad just received notice of an emergency board meeting." My chest stayed steady. "That sounds important." "Don't play games with me, Lila," she snapped. "Margaret Coleman hasn't requested a board meeting in 15 years. Another pause. "Did you do something?" For a moment I looked around the office. Same gray carpet. Same humming printers. Same coworkers walking past my desk without noticing me. The difference was invisible. But it was real. "Maybe the board has concerns about the company," I said quietly. "You work in the copy room," Vanessa replied coldly. "You don't even know what the board discusses." I almost smiled. Some of you listening know exactly how strange that moment feels. When people underestimate you so completely that they stop asking the right questions. If you've ever lived through that, type "I understand." Because Vanessa's voice changed slightly after that. Less confident. More suspicious. "Lila," she said slowly. "If you're trying to embarrass Dad..." "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone." My voice stayed calm. "I'm just letting the board look at the facts." That was when the line went completely silent. For 3 long seconds. Then Vanessa whispered something I had never heard her say before. "What facts?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was already moving. Paperwork filed. Board members notified. A meeting scheduled. And by tomorrow morning, my father, the man who had spent 28 years calling me the dumb one, was about to discover something that would shake his entire world. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had always felt intimidating to me. Tall windows. A long walnut table. Leather chairs arranged with quiet authority. For 2 years, I had passed that room in the hallway without ever stepping inside. That morning, I walked in. And every seat at the table slowly turned toward me. My father was already there. Gerald Carrington sat at the head of the table with his usual calm expression, the one he used during investor meetings and press interviews. Vanessa stood beside him in a navy suit that looked like it had been designed specifically for moments like this. When they saw me, the calm cracked. "What is she doing here?" Vanessa asked sharply. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Lila," he said, the way someone speaks to a child who wandered into the wrong room. "This meeting isn't for staff." Margaret Coleman stepped forward before I could respond. "I invited her." The words landed quietly, but the room shifted. My father turned toward Margaret. "She has no standing in this meeting." Margaret's eyes didn't move. "That depends," she replied calmly, "on what she's about to present." 12 board members watched the exchange. Some curious, some cautious. My father exhaled slowly and sat back in his chair. "Fine," he said. "Let's hear the entertainment." Vanessa gave a small, tight smile. "Just try not to embarrass yourself, Lila." I walked to the end of the table and placed my folder down. My hands were steady now. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because something had changed inside me the moment I opened my grandmother's letter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking permission to be in the room. I opened the folder. If you're still here with me in this story, there's a reason. Somewhere along the way, you've probably been underestimated too. And if quiet strength means something to you, stand where integrity stands. Subscribe. Because the document I placed on that boardroom table next made every person in that room sit up straighter, including my father. The moment my father saw the document, his expression changed. Not dramatically. My father had spent 40 years mastering the art of looking calm in expensive rooms. But I noticed the shift. His shoulders stiffened slightly. His eyes moved faster than usual across the page. And for the first time since I walked in, he stopped treating me like background noise. "What is this?" he asked slowly. Across the table, several board members leaned forward. Margaret Coleman folded her hands calmly. "It's Eleanor Carrington's final will," she said. The air in the room tightened. My father's head snapped up. "That's impossible." His voice stayed controlled, but something underneath it had sharpened. "My mother's will was finalized in 2015. I met his gaze. "This one was signed in 2019. Silence filled the boardroom. Vanessa reached for the paper next. Her confidence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she frowned. "That can't be right." The chairman of the board, Robert Hale, adjusted his glasses and read the document again carefully. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Well," he said slowly, "this is significant." My father leaned forward. "This is some kind of misunderstanding." Before anyone else could speak, the man standing near the far end of the room stepped forward. Gray suit. Silver hair. Jonathan Ellis. "My name is Jonathan Ellis," he said calmly. "I was Eleanor Carrington's attorney." Several board members recognized the name immediately. Ellis and Hartwell was one of the most respected firms in the city. I personally witnessed the signing of this will in September of 2019. The room fell completely still. Because now the words on that paper carried weight no one could dismiss. Ellis looked around the table. "This document grants Miss Lila Carrington." He paused. 51% controlling interest in Carrington Properties. If you've been listening this far and felt that moment land the way it just did, join where dignity stands. Subscribe. Because the silence that followed that sentence, he was the first time in 28 years my father truly looked at me with something new. Not disappointment, not irritation, fear. For a moment, no one in the boardroom spoke. Not my father, not my sister, not even the directors who had spent decades making decisions worth millions of dollars. Because the number 51% changes the air in a room. It's the difference between influence and control. My father leaned back slowly in his chair. "That will is invalid," he said. The confidence in his voice sounded practiced, like he had already decided the conclusion before hearing the facts. My mother was elderly, vulnerable. Someone clearly manipulated her. Jonathan Ellis didn't raise his voice, but the way he straightened his tie carried its own authority. "Mr. Carrington," he said calmly, I would advise caution before suggesting fraud. Several board members exchanged looks. Ellis continued. Mrs. Eleanor Carrington signed that will in full capacity with 2 independent witnesses present. The original document is held in escrow at Chase Private Client. My father's jaw tightened. Vanessa stepped forward. Even if that were true, she said sharply, Lila has no experience running a company. Her eyes turned toward me. You've worked in the copy room for 2 years. A few board members shifted in their seats. I let the silence sit for a moment before answering. I'm not here to run the company. That surprised them, including Margaret. I'm here, I continued calmly, to ask the board a question. Robert Hale folded his hands. What question is that, Miss Carrington? I met my father's eyes. Does the board still have confidence in Gerald Carrington as CEO? The room went still again. Because suddenly this meeting wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about leadership. If you've ever seen power shift quietly in a room like that, you know how heavy those seconds can feel. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives with a single question placed carefully on the table. And my father realized that the moment I finished speaking, the longest 30 seconds of my life happened in complete silence. No one moved. No one reached for their phone. 12 board members sat around that long walnut table staring at the question I had just placed in the middle of the room. Not a dramatic question. Not a cruel one. Just a simple one. Did they still trust my father to lead the company? Across from me, Gerald Carrington slowly folded his hands together. He had spent his entire career controlling rooms like this. But control is a strange thing. The moment someone asks the question you don't want asked, it begins to slip. This is ridiculous, Vanessa said sharply. Her voice cut through the silence like glass. This meeting was called under false pretenses. She looked around the table. My sister doesn't even understand how this company works. A few directors shifted slightly in their seats. My father remained very still. Then Robert Hale, the board chairman, cleared his throat. Miss Carrington, he said carefully, are you proposing a formal motion? I nodded. Yes. Another ripple of quiet moved through the room. Under the company bylaws, I continued, the board has the right to hold a vote of confidence in executive leadership. I glanced briefly toward the portrait on the wall behind them. My grandmother, Eleanor Carrington, had hung there for decades, watching every meeting that happened in that room. The same bylaws my grandmother wrote, I added softly. Margaret Coleman spoke immediately. I second the motion. Now the room truly shifted. Because a second meant the vote had to happen. My father leaned forward slightly. For the first time that morning, he spoke directly to me. Lila, he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice. Just something colder. You don't understand what you're doing. Maybe that had been true once. But not anymore. If you've stayed with this story this far, you already know something important. Strength doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly for years before anyone notices. And if you believe quiet strength deserves a place in this world, we don't shout. We stand. Subscribe. Because the vote that happened next was the moment the entire Carrington empire changed direction. The vote didn't happen the way movies make it look. No dramatic speeches. No raised voices. Just 12 people sitting around a polished table, each one quietly deciding whether the man who had led their company for 20 years still deserved to sit at the head of it. Robert Hale adjusted his glasses and spoke calmly. All those in favor of expressing continued confidence in Gerald Carrington as CEO, please raise your hand. For a moment, no one moved. Then 4 hands lifted slowly. 4. My father didn't react. He kept his eyes forward, face perfectly still. But I noticed something small. His fingers tightened slightly against the table. Robert Hale nodded once. Thank you. Then he continued. All those expressing no confidence. This time the hands rose more quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 hands. 7 directors who had watched my father run the company for years. 7 who had quietly decided it was time for something different. The room felt heavier somehow, like the air itself had changed shape. Robert Hale counted once. Then again. Finally, he set his pen down. The motion carries. His voice remained steady. 7-4, with one abstention. Across the table, my father's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. For the first time that morning, he looked at me fully. Not through me. Not past me. At me. It wasn't anger I saw in his eyes. Not even disappointment. It was recognition. The realization that the daughter he had dismissed for 28 years had just placed a mirror in front of the life he had built. Robert continued reading from the company bylaws. Under Section 14.3, a vote of no confidence requires the CEO to submit a formal resignation within 30 days. No applause followed. No celebration. Because real power shifts rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They feel quiet. Almost solemn. Vanessa stood abruptly. "This is insane," she said. "You're destroying our family's reputation over a technicality." I shook my head gently. "This isn't revenge." My voice stayed calm. "This is governance." Margaret Coleman smiled faintly. My father slowly rose from his chair. For a second I thought he might argue. Or shout. Or threaten a lawsuit. Instead, he simply buttoned his jacket. Then he looked at the portrait of my grandmother on the wall. Eleanor Carrington watched the room the same way she always had, calm, steady, patient. Finally, my father turned back to me, and in a voice much quieter than usual, he said the last thing I expected. "I underestimated you." Then he walked out of the boardroom without another word. If this moment in the story says something to you, if you've ever been underestimated until the truth finally had space to stand up, remember this. Real power moves in silence. Subscribe. Because the hardest part of that day didn't happen inside the boardroom. It happened in the hallway 5 minutes later. When my parents finally stopped pretending this was just business. The boardroom door had barely closed behind my father when the hallway outside filled with tension. You know, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just heavy. Board members filtered out slowly, speaking in low voices, their polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. Some nodded politely as they passed me. Others avoided eye contact completely. Power had shifted, and everyone in that hallway could feel it. I stood there for a moment, holding my folder against my chest, trying to steady the wave of adrenaline that was finally starting to fade. That was when I heard my name. "Lila." My father's voice. I turned. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, my mother beside him. Vanessa stood a few steps behind them, arms crossed tightly across her chest. For the first time in my life, my parents looked uncertain. Not angry. Not proud. Just uncertain. My father approached slowly. When he stopped in front of me, his voice dropped low enough that only we could hear. "You think this makes you powerful?" I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was something very different from what he expected. "I never wanted power," I said quietly. "I wanted respect." That landed harder than any accusation. My mother spoke next. Her voice trembled slightly. "Lila, you humiliated your father in front of the entire board." I met her eyes. "No," I said gently. "I showed them the truth." Vanessa shook her head. "You've destroyed everything Dad built." The words hung in the air. And for a moment I thought about correcting her. About reminding her who had actually built the company in the first place. But I didn't. Instead, I said something simpler. "Grandma built it." Silence followed. The kind that forces people to sit with facts they've spent years avoiding. My father studied my face for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just looked tired. And maybe just for a second honest. "If you think this will make you happy," he said quietly, "you're wrong." I nodded. I know. Because happiness had never been the point. Dignity was. If you've ever had to stand up for your dignity in a room where people expected you to stay quiet, you already understand this moment. And if that kind of quiet strength matters to you, stand with us. Subscribe. Because what happened after that conversation changed something even more important than the company. It changed my family. And not in the way anyone expected. The strange thing about winning a fight you never wanted is that it doesn't feel like victory. When I left Carrington Tower that afternoon, Manhattan looked exactly the same as it always had. Yellow taxis crawled through traffic. Street vendors shouted over the hiss of hot dog carts. People hurried past with coffee cups and phones pressed to their ears, completely unaware that somewhere on the 42nd floor of a glass building behind me, an entire family story had just fallen apart. The city kept moving, but something inside me had stopped. For 28 years, I had lived inside a version of myself that other people wrote. The slow one, the extra daughter, the quiet disappointment standing at the edge of every photograph. And when you live inside a story like that long enough, you begin to believe it's permanent. That you are exactly who they say you are. That night, sitting in my small apartment with the will spread across my kitchen table, I realized something that changed everything. My grandmother hadn't given me power. She had given me permission. Permission to stop asking my family for approval. Permission to stop shrinking myself so other people could stay comfortable. Permission to exist without apologizing. The next morning, my father submitted his resignation. 30 days later, the board announced an interim CEO while they began searching for permanent leadership. A week after that, they offered me something unexpected. Not the CEO role. Not a throne. A seat. Strategic advisor to the board. A voice in the room where decisions were made. When Margaret Coleman called to tell me, her voice carried a quiet warmth. "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing," she said. I smiled. "I think she did." Margaret laughed softly. "Eleanor didn't leave you the company because you were the smartest person in the room." She paused. "She left it to you because she trusted your character. That mattered more than any title. Because the real inheritance wasn't money. It was clarity." Over the next few months, my family began adjusting to a new reality. Not perfectly. Healing never looks that clean. My mother started calling once a week. At first, the conversations were short and careful, like two people learning a language they should have spoken years ago. Sometimes she apologized. Sometimes she simply asked how my day was. Vanessa and I met for coffee in Central Park one afternoon. The first 10 minutes were awkward. Two sisters who had grown up under the same roof but never really known each other. Halfway through the conversation, she stared down at her cup and said quietly, "I didn't realize how hard things were for you." I looked at her and answered honestly, "I didn't realize how much pressure you were carrying either." Because that was the truth. Being overlooked hurts. But being the golden child is its own kind of prison. These days I still walk into Carrington Tower sometimes. Through the front entrance. The security guard greets me by name now. But the biggest change isn't how people see me. It's how I see myself. Dyslexia didn't make me slow. It made me patient. Being underestimated didn't make me weak. It taught me how to observe. The years of silence didn't erase my value. They built it. And if you've listened all the way to the end of this story, I want to leave you with something my grandmother once told me. Your worth is not decided by the people who failed to see it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop trying to convince them and start believing yourself. If this story spoke to you tonight, if you've ever been the one people overlooked or underestimated, remember this. Strength doesn't beg, it builds. Subscribe. Because this space exists for stories about dignity, quiet courage, and people who refuse to disappear. And if this story reminded you of someone who needs that kind of strength right now, share it with them. Sometimes one story is all it takes to help someone realize they were never the dumb one. They were simply the one no one had truly listened to yet.